AP World, Chapter 30. Question 1. Why did the Cold War end? In the later years of the 1970s, there appeared to be some reasons for pride in the Soviet system. Soviet military displays, athletic and artistic success, and continued diplomatic parity with the United States as a result of détente were all seen as gauges of Soviet success. Additionally, it seemed that there was less of a reliance on terror tactics than previously had been the case, and this relative tranquility appeared to signify a satisfaction on the part of the Russian people. Significantly, however, these gauges of success carried inflated import when viewed from outside the Soviet Union. Unnoticed outside the Soviet Union was an economy that was deteriorating. Forced industrialization had produced extensive environmental damage, and according to Soviet estimates, 50% of agricultural land was endangered by the late 1980s. 20% of Russians lived in ecological disaster areas. There was a high prevalence of respiratory illness, which had a negative impact on both morale and economic output. In some parts of Russia, infant mortality rates were some of the highest in the world. Most significantly, industrial production began to stagnate as a result of rigid central planning, health problems, and low worker morale. A cycle developed whereby a poor standard of living affected worker morale and therefore the quality and volume of industrial output. The resulting economic downturn led to a deterioration of the standard of living, which had a negative effect on worker morale, and the cycle began again. Because of the need to maintain a show of strength in the Cold War, the Soviets couldn't afford to cut back on military expenditures. As the Soviet economy contracted, therefore, the overall percentage of the state budget devoted to military expenditure increased. The Soviet military budget became a parasite that was slowly killing its host. Eventually, the deteriorating economy produced conditions in Russia that were no longer sustainable, and attempted reforms only exacerbated negative public sentiment. The Soviet Union simply could not support itself, and the world was shocked when it rapidly deteriorated, ultimately disbanding in 1991. Question 2. What were glasnost and perestroika, and how might they have contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union? A series of uninspiring leaders had contributed much to the problems facing the Soviet Union at the dawn of the 1980s. As this old guard died out, younger members of the Central Committee began to acknowledge that a change in direction was needed. This pragmatism was embodied in Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last leader of the Soviet Union. Having risen to the top of the Communist Party, Gorbachev embarked on a series of reforms designed to revitalize the Soviet Union both socially and economically. Internally, Gorbachev initiated a policy of glasnost, or openness, which eased some restrictions on protest and criticism. To address the economic stagnation, Gorbachev pressed for a reduction in bureaucratic inefficiency and a revitalization of underperforming labor. His policies encouraged more decentralized decision-making and introduced some free market incentives to encourage growth. The effectiveness of Gorbachev's policies was limited by his ultimate adherence to the Soviet system. He had hoped that he could stimulate progress with piecemeal rather than systemic change. What no one predicted was that his attempt to spark limited growth would actually bring about the systemic disruption he had desperately tried to avoid. At the forefront of his reform program was perestroika, a restructuring of the Soviet economy that allowed for decentralization and some private ownership. Far from providing sufficient incentive to allow the Soviet system to continue, perestroika exposed to the Russian people its backwardness, which only whetted their consumer appetite and emboldened criticism and protest. Question 3. In what way were the genocides in Yugoslavia and Rwanda the product of imperialism? The breakup of the Soviet Union and the overall collapse of global communism laid bare underlying tensions that had heretofore been obscured by authoritarian repression. The tragedy that unfolded in what had been the country of Yugoslavia is perhaps the best illustration of this. The formation of the Yugoslavian state itself was at once a rejection of imperialism and a result of the imperial mindset. Located at what had historically been a boundary between various competing empires, the states that would comprise Yugoslavia were subject to intense imperial pressure at the outset of World War I. Such was the friction between imperialist and nationalist impulses, it comes as no surprise that the Balkans would produce the catalyst for what would become World War I. Austro-Hungarian imperialist saber-rattling provoked the Serbian nationalist quote-unquote Black Hand into assassinating the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The subsequent Austro-Hungarian/German occupation of the region during World War I only intensified the pan-Slavic sense of national identity, and in the spirit of white European self-determination that permeated the Paris Peace Conference after the war's end, the state of Yugoslavia was born out of a combination of the pre-existing kingdoms of Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. However, in an expression of typically arrogant Western European imperialism, the borders of the new Yugoslavia were drawn up without consideration of the consequences of imposing an artificial national identity on peoples who, left to themselves, would have preferred separation. The genocide that occurred during the Yugoslavian Civil War was a tragic expression of the incompatibility of these national identities. The Serbian program of ethnic cleansing was born of a contempt and superiority complex which were themselves byproducts of this externally and inorganically imposed unity. Likewise, the Rwandan genocide was a direct consequence of arrogant and arbitrarily drawn borders, compounded by paternalistic and supremely racist attitudes of European colonial powers towards the oppressed African population. To facilitate the control and administration of their colony, the Belgians, who had seized control of the territory from the Germans during World War I, favored the minority Tutsi people over the majority Hutus. In the imperial calculus, it made sense to elevate a minority, thus guaranteeing their loyalty, rather than delegate responsibilities to the majority Hutus, who might then use that position as the basis for anti-colonial resistance. Tutsis thus were viewed as agents of imperial oppression, and resentment towards them exploded into violence and civil war in the period after decolonization. The conflict and bloodshed culminated horrifically in the Rwandan genocide. Occurring over approximately 100 days during the spring and summer of 1994, the genocide resulted in the systematic murders of Tutsis and moderate Hutus at the hands of Hutu nationalists. The estimated 500,000 to 1 million deaths came largely at the hands of spontaneously formed militias, armed mostly with machetes and clubs. Were it not for the imperial-imposed social order, the conditions leading to the Rwandan genocide may not have existed. Question 4. Why has ethnic and religious tension in the Middle East persisted in the years since the end of the Cold War? Arab nationalism grew in the decades before World War I in reaction to the oppressive rule of the Turkic Ottomans. Rather than producing an era of Arab liberation, the defeat of the Ottomans in World War I merely shifted the mantle of imperialist oppressor to the French and British empires. Promised self-determination in exchange for assistance in the fight against the Ottomans, the Arab peoples were justifiably enraged when it became apparent that they were to be denied that opportunity. Compounding this sense of betrayal was the signaling, on the part of the Western powers, of support for a Jewish state to be located in the traditional Semitic homeland of Palestine, which had nevertheless had an ethnically Arab populace for centuries. When the State of Israel was recommended under UN Resolution 181, both the Palestinians and the Arab League rejected it. The State of Israel was thus imposed on a populace who had demonstratively objected to it, and who would have little say in its governance. an ill-considered partition plan was rendered moot by the series of attacks on Israel by its Arab neighbors. Israeli victories, against all odds, in each engagement reduced Palestinian territory until there was no Palestinian sovereignty. Complicating the issue was the geopolitical significance of Israel in the context of the Cold War. Its location near the strategically crucial Middle Eastern oil fields meant that Israel would be a key U.S. ally in the Cold War. The hostility of the Arab states and, closely related, the broader Muslim world was therefore directed at the U.S. The creation of the State of Israel was viewed as simply the latest Western imperial imposition on the Arab world. Israel's growth as a regional power and its increasingly questionable policies towards the now stateless Palestinians and the manipulation of the Iranians and others have only served to perpetuate the violence and instability. The most recent atrocity committed by Palestinian extremists, exacerbated by the asymmetric Israeli response, means that there is little hope for regional stability in the near future. Question 5. What is the cause of anti-American Islamic extremist violence? How has the U.S. responded to this violence, and how has this affected America's position in the world? The origins of modern anti-Western sentiment in the Arab and Muslim world date back to the sense of betrayal after World War I, when, despite promises made to the contrary, the Western powers of France and Britain installed themselves as de facto imperialist rulers of the region. As mentioned earlier, this denial of sovereignty was only compounded by growing support in the West for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which had been mostly Arab for centuries. This initial wave of hostility was not directed specifically at the United States, but when the State of Israel was created in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, the U.S. became its primary backer. Steadfast U.S. support of Israel throughout the 20th century is the primary cause of anti-American hostility in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Separate from the Israeli issue is the morally questionable foreign policy agenda the United States pursued in the region during the Cold War, in a pattern that can be seen throughout the world in the latter half of the 20th century. The United States consistently supported authoritarian regimes if they sided with the U.S. against the Soviet Union. There is no clearer case of this than the CIA-backed coup in 1953 that removed the democratically elected socialist reformer Mohammad Mossadegh and replaced him with the brutally authoritarian regime of Shah Reza Pahlavi. More recently, hostility in the Muslim world towards the U.S. has been prolonged and perhaps exacerbated by the unilateral American response to the September 11, 2001 attacks.